Okay, then, this is Mount Olympus in northeastern Greece. It's about 9,500 feet high and was, of course, regarded as the home of the gods. Probably it was never climbed in antiquity. The first record of someone reaching the top is only from 1929, but it is not regarded as difficult by today's mountaineers, and several hundred people make it to the top every year now. As I said, it was regarded as the home of the gods, not the Athenian gods, nor the Spartan gods, nor the Corinthian gods, but the Greek gods. The Greek city-states, for all their differences and violent conflicts with one another, shared certain important traditions. They were Greek, everyone else was a barbarian. In addition to their common pantheon, they also, of course, shared a language, and that was perhaps the key thing that gave them a sense of being part of the same race, in a sense, and helped them unite against the common Persian enemy. Mount Olympus was never the site of important religious festivals, but there were several places which were regarded as sacred by, again, all Greeks together. Delos was one such place, and Delphi was another. We'll see it next week, but perhaps the most important religious site in Greece was Olympia, which was sort of the summer residence of the gods in the northwestern corner of the Peloponnesus. And this is a view over the whole sacred precinct there now. According to tradition, the Olympic Games began with a chariot race between Pelops and Oenomaus, about which we heard a couple of lectures ago. A tradition not consistent with another tradition which held that the first games were in 776 BC, but that doesn't seem to have worried anyone. So important was this festival that the Greeks dated events by Olympiads. 776 to 772 was the first Olympiad, 772 to 768 was the second Olympiad, and so on. You might wonder why the Greeks would pick such an out-of-the-way place for such an important festival, but they didn't pick it. The gods picked it. The Greeks built temples and held religious observances where it was thought the gods wanted them, not where it was convenient for men to have them. And speaking of temples, from Mycenae about 1300 to the Temple of Hera at Olympia in the 7th century, there is essentially no Greek building surviving. Not even a complete foundation, and that's pretty startling, a 600-year gap. But as we've heard, apart from pottery, there is virtually nothing surviving in any of the arts from that period in Greek history. This is a little clay model of an archaic temple, probably made in the 8th century BC, which perhaps gives some clues about what such buildings might have looked like, but it's a long way from this to the Parthenon. There are very fragmentary remains of examples elsewhere, but the oldest Greek temple, the foundations of which completely survive, is in fact the Temple of Hera at Olympia, which you see now. It was built in the late 7th century, but there are indications that there were also perhaps two earlier and similar buildings on the same site. You can see a reconstruction of what it was like, and if you think back to the last Greek buildings we did see at Knossos, Mycenae, Tiryns, or Troy, this clearly owes nothing to any of them. The especially distinctive thing about it is the peripteral colonnade, the series of columns encircling the building. As I mentioned earlier, Egypt was the source for the most characteristic thing about Greek archaic sculpture, and Egypt was also the source for the columns here. There are examples still standing in the Temple of Hatshepsut that could be mistaken for these at a distance, and there are earlier models going all the way back to the Step Pyramid complex. Important as that Egyptian influence is, however, the Egyptians themselves never built anything that looks at all like this. Some nameless architects in the middle of the Greek Dark Ages were the inventors of this, perhaps the most influential of all architectural styles. This is a picture of the model in the museum at Olympia, which shows you what the precinct was once like. And you can see the Temple of Hera now at the upper left. It's important to notice that the earliest temple here was dedicated to Hera and not her husband Zeus. This is sometimes cited in support of the theory that female divinities were more important than male ones in the early history of Greece, and of course Athens was especially devoted to Athena throughout its whole history, Hera also, as a matter of fact, remained very important in the Peloponnesus. One of the most important of all shrines was her temple near Argos. Be that as it may, however, by the time the Temple of Zeus in the center of the model was built, around 460, he was clearly more important. His place is twice as big, and in addition, a sort of water playpen, the Nymphaeum for his favorite nymphs, has been installed right behind the temple of his wife. And the colonnaded stoa at the upper right is named after Echo, whose job was to warn him when Hera was coming if he were cavorting with the nymphs. Other important things here are the end of the stadium behind the stoa of Echo, the treasuries in which votive offerings from various cities were left, and the many bronze statues around the grounds. As I've mentioned before, the Greeks did most of their freestanding sculpture in bronze. The Roman Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, says he saw 3,000 statues here, which were put up, in theory at least, not to honor the athletes who are their subjects, but to thank the gods for their help. All of them are gone thanks to the fact that bronze can be recycled. This is what the Temple of Zeus looks like today. For 1,000 years it was in pretty good shape, but in 610 AD a big earthquake knocked the whole thing off its foundations. The columns here could be reassembled, but they're of poor quality limestone, not marble, and the general view is that it wouldn't be worth the effort to get them back up. This does give you a clear idea, though, of how the Greeks almost always assembled the columns from drums like those you see here. They rarely carved the columns whole. Both this and the Temple of Hera are in what's called the Doric style, Doric because it developed in the Peloponnesus, which was the area which became the primary home of the invading Dorians we heard about earlier this quarter. We'll hear more shortly about the details that distinguish this style. When we think of Olympia now, the first thing to come to mind is the athletic events, but of course most modern events were not part of the ancient Greek program. The Greeks did not play ice hockey, baseball, or for heaven's sake, badminton. This is thought to have been part of the Palaestra at Olympia, where wrestling competitions were held, but even wrestling didn't become an Olympic sport until the games had gone on for centuries. The original contests were the chariot race, the broad jump, the 200-yard dash, the discus, and the javelin. Wrestling, as I said, was added later, along with the 400-yard run, a 2 2/3 mile run, and the pankration, which was sort of the Greek equivalent to no-holds-barred kickboxing. Herbert Muller says that the Greeks put more emphasis on athletics than on just about anything else, and that the man from the 20th century who would feel most comfortable in ancient Athens would not be the philosopher or the dramatist, the architect or the sculptor, but the professional athlete. The usual assumption, of course, is that modern athletes are much faster and more powerful than their predecessors, and they certainly are bigger on average. There were no stopwatches at the Olympic Games, so we can't directly compare speeds, of course, but if modern athletes had to run barefoot and stark naked as the Greeks did, that might slow them down a little. In the museum at Olympia is a rock which is relevant to this issue. It's inscribed, "Old Bybon lifted this over his head with one hand, and it weighs 316 pounds. I doubt any man today could just pick this up and do that, although if it were placed on a shoulder-high stand, there are some who could probably press it up with one hand. The record set about 30 years ago for the clean and jerk for a two-handed barbell lifted off the ground and over the head is, I think, something over 800 pounds, and is, again, I think, still held by that marvel of Russian steroid science, Andrei Alexeyev. And there are several NFL football linemen who can bench press well over 400 pounds, but again, that's with two hands. The most famous Greek strongman was Milo of Crotona, who is known for lifting a calf every day as it grew until finally, when it was a bull, he could still lift it. Unfortunately, hubris, his pleasure in his own accomplishments got the best of him in one day when he saw some lumberjacks trying to split a still-standing tree. He just told them to stand back, put his hands in the break they were making, and pushed the two halves apart by himself. They applauded. He withdrew his hands to bow, and the two halves snapped back, squishing old Milo. Here's the stadium as it looks today. Some Greek stadiums have seats, but since the performances were for the gods, not human spectators, the comfort of the latter was not supposed to be a major consideration. Even if you're a die-hard Raiders fan or an old blue who hasn't missed a game in 40 years, you can probably tell the difference between a football game and a religious event, between Memorial Stadium and a church, but in some parts of the country the distinction isn't that clear. I was watching a football game once between Oklahoma and Texas, and it's common to have an invocation delivered before encounters of such earth-shaking significance. On this occasion, after saying the usual things, asking the Lord to prevent injuries and to let the best team win, the minister went on to say, "And Lord, if you can find time in your busy schedule for a few hours, please join us today for this fine football game." That sounds a bit bizarre even for Texas, but it's exactly the Greek attitude. The game was for the gods. This is the starting line in the stadium. Until recently, it wasn't known how the races were begun so that no one could get a jump. But the University of California has done extensive research on how this was done in the stadium at Nemea, and a similar method seems to have been used here. If the scholars are right, the apparatus was really pretty complicated. But to return to what I was saying about the Greek attitude, it has even been argued that one of the things that led the Greeks to believe in gods in the first place was the fact that they hated to think of any accomplishment, athletic or otherwise, being wasted, to which there was no witness. If there were gods who saw everything, this problem would be solved. I should mention that you have been and are hearing, still for the moment, two instruments that were very popular with the Greeks, the lyre and the panpipe. Now, although the Temple of Zeus has never been restored itself, a lot of the sculptural decoration of it has been recovered and is on display now in the Olympia Museum. It is in fact regarded as the finest surviving ensemble of severe-style sculpture in existence, and it is common to hear it ranked in terms of artistic worth just below the decoration of the Parthenon itself. Greek temples were typically aligned east-west, and this is the sculpture from the pediment of the east or front side of the temple. The pediment of the temple is the triangular space between the roof and the colonnade, and you can see how the program here reflects the shape of the space it occupied. The subject is the story of that archetypal chariot race with which the games are said to have begun. Pelops won it, remember, and the whole area was named after him. This is the center of it now. At the right are King Oenomaus and his wife. At the left is Pelops, who won the race by bribing the king's charioteer and then throwing the latter off a cliff to prevent him from ever leaking this. And you should remember that this episode was also the origin of the curse, the bad luck that befell the descendants of Pelops. In the center is the magnificent figure of Zeus, towering over mere mortals, but the image of man nevertheless. The sculptural ensemble on the west side is, if anything, even finer than the one on the east. This sculpture tells the story of the Lapiths and Centaurs, about which we've heard a little when I was talking about the Francois Vase a couple of lectures ago. The Lapith king invited his low-class centaur relatives to his wedding, and they drank too much, made a mess of the reception to the point that Apollo himself had to intervene and restore order, as he is seen doing here. He occupies the apex of the pediment, as Zeus is there on the east side. Here's a better view of Apollo now. 9 feet tall and the very image of civilized strength in this dog pound of random chaos. Probably more has been written about the significance of Apollo on the Greek outlook than that of any other god, even more than the Lapiths, who were taken to represent the positive things in human nature, reason, morality, and so on, fighting off the negative things, irrationality, cruelty, and so on, represented by the centaurs. Apollo was thought to embody the principle of civilization. He was regarded as the source of inspiration and creativity and was associated with the Muses at Delphi, but he was also considered the divine partisan of order and law, and it's in this latter role that we see him acting in this ensemble. It's been argued, most famously by Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, that in essence the greatness of Greek art was due to the order imposed upon savage strength, which without control is dissipated in Dionysiac frenzy. Similarly, the greatest people, like artists and saints in Nietzsche's view, are those who can control the greatest passions. And those people we should regard as the best are potentially the most dangerous, according to this view. As I said, this whole ensemble is considered the finest surviving example of the severe style. And this again is the style of more or less the first half of the 5th century BC, and although the centaurs grimace appropriately, the human figures, including Apollo, wear the mask-like expression that's typical of the style. While we see some more pictures of this work, we're going to hear a fragment of Greek music, the performance of which is one of those undertaken by Gregorio Paniagua. The main instrument you'll hear now is the aulos. The Greeks used this term very loosely, but it usually refers to the double-reeded twin-piped woodwind often seen in ancient art, and which is the ancestor of the medieval shawm and modern oboe. The kithara and the psalterion, which are plucked string instruments that have modern descendants, are also heard, as well as various kinds of percussion instruments. And Apollo himself, the picture of cool strength. The metopes depict the labors of Hercules, and here we see him holding up the world with the help of Athena, as Atlas, whose regular job this was, returns with the golden apples of the Hesperides for him. The source of the music you're hearing, by the way, is the Vienna Papyrus G2315, which was found at Hermopolis Magna in Egypt, and is thought to be the work of the playwright-composer Euripides, about whom we'll hear more next week. On this metope, Hercules is bringing the metal-clawed and feathered Stymphalian birds to Athena, but the birds have disappeared. The story of Hercules' labors may have been chosen for the metopes here because of the similarity between his adventures, maybe, in athletic contests, although it's often hard to be sure about the rationale behind the sculptural decoration of such temples. As I mentioned, there were once thousands of bronze statues on the grounds at Olympia, but none survive. This is the famous bronze charioteer found at Delphi and now in the museum there, however, and he's probably the only such surviving work, from any of the regular stadium and religious festival sites. We'll hear next time about the Pythian Games at Delphi, and this statue was commissioned by Polydeuces of Gela on Sicily, who won the chariot race there in 477 BC. When he was dug up in 1898, he was the only freestanding Greek bronze statue that had ever been found. He's a bit of an anomaly for an athlete, however, because he is fully clothed, but it apparently was usual for charioteers to compete wearing this kind of tunic. Here he is up closer, and this is again the characteristic look of the severe style, the idealized look of a man whose body's in one place and whose mind is somewhere else. The eyes are inlaid with colored marble, and even the eyelashes survive, as you can see. It was cast in 7 pieces and then assembled. You're hearing an instrument that's in the harp family. It's called the cordae obliqui by the Romans, but the Greeks played a similar instrument. In 1926, a second life-size, actually nearly 7 foot tall, Greek bronze in the severe style was found in the water off Cape Artemision, where the famous battle we heard about last time was fought in 480 BC, and it's possible that this fellow was put up there as a votive offering afterwards. He's thought to be either Zeus or Poseidon, depending on whether you think he's throwing a trident or a thunderbolt, but since it's uncommon for us to see people throwing either tridents or thunderbolts now, it's hard to know who this is, though that it's Zeus is the usual assumption. He could in fact be an athlete throwing a javelin, and even if he isn't, it's likely there were bronze figures at Olympia that looked a lot like this one. The fisherman who found him went to the University of Thessalonica and told the professors there, who just laughed. After all, only one such thing had turned up in the whole history of modern archaeology. How likely was it that a couple of peasants had caught the most impressive of all surviving Greek bronzes in a fishing net? The indignant fisherman, however, then went back, cut the god's arm off, and brought that to Thessalonica, which produced a very satisfying dropping of jaws in the archaeology department. In the last lecture, I mentioned the archaic bronze called the Piraeus Apollo, found there in 1959, which became the third and oldest life-size Greek bronze to be found. And then in 1972, 2 more severe-style figures were discovered, the so-called Riace bronzes found in the Strait of Messina. This is one of them now. These 7-foot-tall statues probably represent warriors, since they once carried shields on their left arms, but they too could pass for Olympic athletes. This is the other one now. These bronzes have been attributed to both Phidias and Polykleitos, 2 of the greatest Greek sculptors of the 5th century, but that's little better than guesswork. It's tempting to try to read something philosophical into the preoccupation of Greek artists with the human body, and especially with the idealized male nude. The sculptural traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia are primarily, if not so completely, devoted to the human figure also, but as I've mentioned, the nude is a real rarity before we get to the Greeks. H.W. Jansen says that this is a Roman marble copy, the original of which was a Greek bronze made about 450 BC by Myron. It's called the Discobolus, or discus thrower. I mentioned earlier that the Greeks much preferred bronze to marble as a medium for freestanding statues, and that combined with the fact that marble was also recyclable, it can be heated to get quicklime for cement, is thought to account for the fact that there are probably no freestanding marble statues of the classical period, broadly construed, and not many from before or after that left. The claim that there aren't any such things is pretty much accepted as gospel by art historians, but it is a little hard to justify the claim that a statue is a copy when you don't have the original with which to compare it, nor anything else that can count as real documentary evidence. I'm not saying this isn't original. In fact, for some reason, the copyist in this case left the reference points on the figure's head, making him look like he has little horns, and certainly all but proving that this is in fact a copy. Nevertheless, the kind of arguments often used to prove that a work is a copy don't always carry complete conviction. The Discobolus still wears the severe mask, but his body is the most animated we've seen yet, all wound up in a corkscrew twist just before the release of the discus. The Zeus of Artemision is similarly poised just at the second before he lets the bolt or whatever fly too, although he isn't quite such an anatomical tour de force. These figures are not in action in the way a hurdler might be, stopped by a camera in mid-jump. They are stopped at what we might call the point of maximum tension. They are stopped in a split-second break before the action to be performed, which gives them a more dramatic quality somehow, I think, than if they were actually depicted during the action itself. Certainly by the time these figures were done, all trace of significant Egyptian influence was gone, and Greek sculptural style had become something altogether new in the history of art. I digressed from architecture to talk about the Olympic Games and sculpture, but I want to return to it now, and this is the Temple of Apollo at Corinth, sometimes considered second in age to the Temple of Hera at Olympia, and the earliest of all Greek temples to have any of its columns still standing. The ones at the Hera Temple were re-erected in the 19th century. It's likely that these here are still standing in part because they are rare examples of solid shaft columns rather than ones assembled out of drums. They are 24 feet high, 6 feet in diameter, and weigh about 50 tons each. So the temple is a real engineering accomplishment as well as an artistic one. On the west coast of Italy, there was a Greek settlement at what was called Poseidon City, Poseidonia, or today Paestum. I mentioned earlier that many of the finest examples of Greek pottery have been found in Italy, and that important Greek writers like Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Herodotus spent at least parts of their lives there. It's also true that many of the finest examples of Greek sculpture, like the Riace bronzes, have been found there, and even some of the most important Greek temples were built there. Paestum, in fact, has three important ones. The so-called Basilica, or Temple of Hera in the foreground in this picture, is the most well-preserved of all Greek 6th century temples, and in the distance is the building called the Temple of Poseidon, which is one of the most well-preserved 5th century temples. Sometimes the Temple of Poseidon is also called the Second Temple of Hera, and there is still controversy over how they should be named. The third temple, which you can't see in this picture, is usually called the Temple of Ceres, but it may have been built in honor of Athena. In any case, it's smaller and intermediate in date between the two larger and more important temples. You can very clearly see what's called the entasis in the columns of the Temple of Hera in the foreground. Entasis is the cigar-shaped quality that is thought to give the columns a more muscular sort of look than they would have if the columns were just straight-edged. Almost all Greek columns curve like this, but the curve usually isn't as obvious as it is here. Here's the Temple of Poseidon up closer now. As I said when I was talking about the temples at Olympia, the earliest style of Greek architecture is called Doric, and it lasts more or less through the building of the Parthenon. Now, the easiest way to identify the Doric style is to look at the tops of the columns. If a column has a flat brick-like piece called an abacus there, that makes the capital of the column Doric, which makes the column Doric, which makes the whole building Doric. A Doric column also sits flat on the floor or stylobate of the temple. It doesn't have any little pedestal. This is a good time to also define a few other terms used by art historians in describing Greek architecture. The concave grooves in the shafts of the columns are called flutes, and at the top of the column is what's called the capital, which, in the Doric style, as I said, consists of the abacus, which itself rests on a pillow-shaped stone called the echinus. Everything that rests on the capitals is called the entablature. The transverse stone right on the capitals is called the architrave, and above that is the frieze level, which consists of alternating metopes and triglyphs. The metopes were always decorated with sculpture, which in this case has disappeared. The triglyphs are the three-part stones between them. The triangular section of the entablature is called the pediment, and it also was always originally decorated with sculpture. This isn't the whole of the vocabulary used to describe buildings like this by any means, but it's enough for ordinary reference for our part in this lecture. It's often suggested that many of the parts of the Greek temple may owe their origin to wooden precedents, but by the 5th century the Greeks had probably long forgotten why they built the temples the way they did. The style and its peculiarities were just taken for granted. It's interesting that even today, when buildings are decorated in the classical style, little things like the gutai, as they are called, below the triglyphs, which may originally have been stone replicas of still earlier nails or pegs, are always included, just because they always have been.
In 1968, just a short distance from these temples, a large underground Greek tomb was found, a rare thing in itself for the 5th century, and its walls, the walls of the tomb and the ceiling were painted, and such a thing has never been found in Greece from that century. It's called the Tomb of the Diver because of the subject on the ceiling. It's generally thought that Etruscan influence is involved, both in the character of the tomb itself, as well as in the sort of carpe diem quality of the paintings. We'll hear more about the Etruscans later. The painted parts of the tomb have been removed and are in the Paestum National Museum. There were in fact many Greek colonies in Italy and on Sicily by the 5th century, and at Agrigento on the southwest coast of Sicily, another of the most well-preserved 5th century Greek temples can be seen, the so-called Temple of Concord. Its fine state of preservation is due in part at least to the fact that it was turned into a church in the 6th century. There are also impressive surviving Greek temples on Sicily at Segesta and Selinunte of approximately the same date. While we get at least a look at these places, we'll hear an attempt made to play the epitaph of Psychelos, called the oldest complete piece of music, the notation of which allows for at least attempted performance today. It is inscribed on a tombstone found in southwestern Turkey, about 30 miles from Miletus. The tombstone was apparently made about 100 AD. The notation is to be seen above the text, but an explanation of the deciphering of it is not within my areas of specialization. The text itself reads, in essence, "Eat, drink, and be merry."
This is the temple of the obscure goddess Aphaea, built on the island of Aegina, or Aegina, or as the Greeks called it, Aegina, near Athens, about 500 BC. It was excavated in the 19th century with the support of Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria, and much of the decoration is now in the Munich Glyptothek. The building itself was not re-erected until the 1950s, however. In the Glyptothek you can see this model of what it was once like, and on the wall at the back is another model of the facade, painted as it is likely the original was. In fact, some fragments that were uncovered did still have paint on them, and the use of color in the decoration of these temples, red, blue especially, and in the decoration of sculpture as well, was really quite extensive. In this view you can see what the interior was like. Around the outside was the peripteral colonnade, which surrounded the cella, entrance to which was provided by the large doors you can see. The cella was essentially just a big hall with a statue of the divinity at the end. These were usually colossal, filling up the whole height of the building, but none have survived. They were usually made of and decorated with valuable material, gold, bronze, and so on. These temples were like Egyptian and Mesopotamian ones, accessible only to the priesthood who cared for the ritual needs of the god. The Greek attitude to what we might call the Olympic religion was a bit mercenary and not very spiritual in practice. The main thing, as in the practice of many religions, was to make sure one gave the gods their due in respect and offerings. Virtue, morality, and spirituality in the modern senses were not emphasized. With the rise and influence of the mystery cults, this would, however, change, as I've mentioned before, and we'll hear more about this next week. Here you can see some of the statuary from the west pediment of this temple, also on display in the Munich Glyptothek. The subject is apparently the Trojan War. Athena, who supported the Greeks, stands in the center. Most of the figures are archaic, insofar as they smile the archaic smile. But the anatomical realism and the complete confidence of the sculptor in rendering it put this all very close to the Severe period. Some think it was actually erected after Marathon or even after the end of the Persian Wars. And in antiquity, the Trojan War, as a conflict between East and West, was often regarded as a prelude to them. But the archaic smile wouldn't be expected on important sculpture as late as 480. Here's a partial view of the East's pediment sculpture, which tells the story of another less well-known war over Troy. Laomedon, the father of Priam, the king of Troy in the Iliad, promised Hercules some horses in exchange for his work building the walls of Troy. But after Hercules was finished, Laomedon wouldn't give him the horses, so Hercules and his friends attacked the city and killed him. Here's the figure of Hercules at the right. And a fallen warrior now. Another interesting Doric-style temple is still difficult to get to and was unknown to scholars in modern times until the late 18th century. This is the Temple of Apollo at Bassae. As I mentioned in another connection, the Greeks built temples not where they were convenient, but where they felt the gods wanted them. Most of the sculptural decoration of it, this temple which survives, is now in the British Museum.
The frieze depicts Greeks fighting various beastly enemies, including Amazons and centaurs.
Writing in the 2nd century A.D., 600 years after it was built, Pausanias said that the architect was Ectinus, who was one of the architects of the Parthenon in Athens. And be that as it may, there now is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens as it looks today. The Agora, the downtown of ancient Athens, was to the north, sort of to the northwest, that is to the left in this picture, and the wall of the city ran about halfway between the Acropolis and Mount Lycabettus that you can see there. It circled around
just beyond the Temple of Zeus, the ruins of which you can see to the extreme right in this picture,
and then took in the Pnyx and Areopagus hills to the west off the screen to the left. At the right is Mount Hymettus, on the other side of which lies Marathon, and to the far northeast is Mount Pentelicus, from which the 25,000 tons of marble required to build the Parthenon were quarried.
It was to be the largest, essentially all marble, Doric-style temple on the mainland.
You can see the ruins of the Propylaea, which is the gateway to the Acropolis, and the Erechtheum also in this picture. This is a view of the Acropolis from the Agora. The place was wrecked, as I mentioned in the first part of this lecture, during the Persian occupation in 480 BC, and there is a good deal of controversy about what the buildings there were like before that event and what might have actually survived the Persians. Be all that as it may, the Parthenon, as it still stands today, was begun in 447 under the auspices of Pericles, by then the most powerful man in Athens, and about whom we'll hear more next week. As I mentioned earlier, he had authorized moving the treasury of the Delian League to Athens, and certainly that wealth contributed much to making the whole new Acropolis possible, at the cost, though, of arousing a good deal of jealousy in parts of the Aegean, and Pericles himself was not to be without local enemies whose political opposition threatened to undermine what was seen in some quarters as the building of a kind of personal monument. His friend, the sculptor and architect Phidias, was the fellow sometimes called the surveyor general of the whole Acropolis project, but the primary architects of the Parthenon were apparently Ictinus and Callicrates. Phidias himself made the colossal statue of Athena of ivory and gold for it, and he was accused of embezzling some of the material, falsely accused apparently. Phidias was then, again apparently, exiled from Athens and went to the Peloponnesus, where he made the equally famous statue of Zeus for the latter's temple at Olympia, which we've seen. From this angle, you can see the reconstructed Temple of Athena Nike and the Propylaea on the Acropolis, both of which we'll hear more about next time. The word Acropolis just means high city, and although a lot of Greek cities had one, the Acropolis, when the term is used without qualification, means this one. And you can see from this point of view what an almost impregnable citadel it was, and why it took the Persians 2 weeks to dislodge a handful of defenders. Here's the Parthenon itself now, as one sees it after coming out onto the top of the plateau from the Propylaea. Plutarch, writing some 600 years after it was built, said that it still looked brand new, and it was essentially intact for about 2,000 years until 1687, when a Venetian shell blew up the gunpowder the Turks were storing in it. A lot has been made of the geometry and proportions of it, and while we don't have time to go into that kind of thing in detail, like the Egyptians, the Greeks did use the so-called golden proportion, and the height of the Parthenon from the bottom of the stepped base, or crepidoma, to the top of the pediment stands to the width essentially as 1 stands to 1.618. This number can be derived in various ways, but the bottom line is that things that embody it are thought to be especially pleasing to the eye. It is puzzling, though, that neither the Egyptians nor the Greeks used it consistently. Only one pyramid embodies it very closely, the Great Pyramid, and only this Greek temple does, the finest of all of them. This is actually the back, the west side of the temple, and the entrance faced east, as was typical for Greek temples. This is the east side, or actual front now. The Parthenon has no straight lines in it. The floor, or stylobate, curves up from the sides so that it is slightly higher in the center, and the architrave bends down to be slightly lower in the center. The columns all exhibit entasis that makes them slightly cigar-shaped. The claim is, in fact, that the eye sees things that are perfectly straight as slightly distorted, so that this effect is reversed by slightly distorting what the eye sees. The effect, it is alleged, is to make the Parthenon look like the most well-made of all buildings, with what seem to be the most perfectly straight lines. Here's a closer view of the building. The fact that the stones are all apparently slightly curved also means that each can go in just one place. This was not a building put up with assembly line blocks. Most of them had to be cut according to the requirements of the one place in it where they were meant to go. Okay, that's where we'll end this lecture. Next time we'll hear more about the Parthenon, especially about its sculptural decoration, and also about the rest of the Acropolis, and we'll visit Delphi, hear about the Peloponnesian War, and also about Greek drama.